Have you ever built a rough draft of a deck and thought, wow, that was really fun the first time. I wonder what would happen if I tweaked it a little bit? Or in Magic the Gathering terms, have you ever built a budget deck and then thought, what would happen if I just souped this thing up way, way, way further than what that original design was supposed to allow for? Well, let's go ahead and talk about what happens when I do that to one of my $15 decks. If you've been on this channel for a while, you know that there are a couple of deck types that I really enjoy. The dungeon mechanic is one that I really heavily lean into, and I also heavily lean into Reanimator decks, probably because of my time with Yu-Gi-Oh!, where Monster Reborn, Call the Haunted, and Premature Burial were kind of the primo ways to cheat cards out on the board. You didn't really have ways in other decks outside of, like, specifically Dark Magician or specifically using, like, Lord of D with dragons. It was just not a thing you did in old Yu-Gi-Oh! Now the game is nothing but cheating out giant monsters who have entire books and just lore behind them in order to understand what they do. So anyway, I'm a Yu-Gi boomer. I apologize. But because of that early time with Yu-Gi-Oh!, I really like Reanimator strategies. And so any commander that can enable a Reanimator strategy is something that I am going to gravitate towards a lot. And messing around with the $15 version of Vohar Desecrator definitely made me feel like I was getting everything I wanted out of a Reanimator deck. The only problem is that the kinds of threatening targets you can summon with Vohar are limited by budget. Some of the most powerful Reanimator cards are locked behind being $1 or more, whereas some of my favorite ones are very inexpensive, but I digress. Let's go ahead and try to build Vohar Desecrator, but this time without a budgetary restriction. Let's just see what we can do when we aim to build a full power version of Vohar. Vohar is a Dimir 1/2 Phyrexian Merfolk wizard with the ability that lets you draw a card and discard a card anytime you tap him. And you can also make everybody burn if you discard an instant or a sorcery card, but we are just not going to be doing that. He also can sacrifice himself to recast an instant or sorcery from your graveyard, which we will be utilizing so that we can reuse Reanimator spells. That all said, the name of the game is very clear. Get big reanimation targets on the board and make them do a lot of work. But there are two aspects of that have to be considered. The first one is, how are we actually going to be reanimating these cards? And for that, we are going to be running a 12-card Reanimator package with the understanding that many of these can be recast simply by destroying our own Vohar. But let's go ahead and look at each of these. Ever After returns 2 target creatures from our graveyard to the battlefield and makes them zombies, and of course Ever After gets thrown into the library afterwards, so it can't be reused with Vohar, but Victimize can be reused with Vohar. We choose 2 creatures in our grave, sack a creature, and then return those creatures to the battlefield tapped. We'll also have Persist to reanimate any non-legendary creatures, Stitch Together, which can reanimate any creature so long as we have 7 or more cards in our graveyard, Necromancy, which can revive any creature in the grave at instant speed, with the downside of having to get rid of it afterwards if we do, but if we cast it at sorcery speed, we get to keep the creature forever, effectively. Dance of the Dead, which casts an aura on a creature in a grave and summons it to the battlefield, and of course we have Animate Dead, which is doing the same thing. They're both Premature Burial and Call of the Haunted, but for Magic the Gathering. Then we have Reanimate to reanimate any one creature in a graveyard, and a Malakir Rebirth to make sure that if our opponents do end up blowing up any of our important cards, we can immediately get them back onto the battlefield at instant speed. But there are 2 other Reanimator spells in here before we get to a big reanimation creature, which are very important for swinging the tempo of the game in our favor. And the first of these is Breach the Multiverse. Force every player to mill 10 cards, then reanimate a creature from everybody's graveyard all onto our battlefield. That is a fantastically powerful effect, and it can win games on its own depending on what cards we have casted from our opponent's graveyards. And remember, if we have 9 mana, we can always just sacrifice our commander and recast this card later on in the game. And speaking of 9 mana, I oopsed win the game cards, we have Rise of the Dark Realms, which reanimates all creatures from all graveyards onto the battlefield under our control. control. If anybody at the table is running an infinite combo, it is very likely Rise of the Dark Realms will assemble that infinite combo, but on your board. I actually saw this happen at a Taco Mac recently while we were having our post-tournament games with food. It's a nasty, nasty card. Then we have Ancient Brass Dragon. Whenever the Brass Dragon deals combat damage to a player, roll a d20, then put any number of creatures with total mana value X or less from any graveyards onto the battlefield under our control, where X is the result that we get from spinning the Brass Dragon's d20. This thing can, again, assemble powerful combos in the blink of an eye, but also being able to reanimate some of our stronger creatures over and over and over again is still fantastic, even if we do not get into any of those more powerful cards. But speaking of those more powerful cards, we do need to talk about what cards we are trying to reanimate as well. These are the bread and butter of what we are going to be doing. These are the terrors that our opponents are going to be terrified of when we drop them onto the battlefield. And speaking of terrors, that is the first one we have to talk about. This monstrosity, Valgavoth the Terror Eater. With flying and lifelink and an ability that makes getting rid of it very hard, ward, sacrifice 3 non-land permanents, he has another ability on top of these, which is if any card we don't control is put into a graveyard from anywhere, exile it instead, and then we get to just cast the card by paying life for that card instead. Valgavoth is a nasty, nasty piece of work, and he has to be taken care of on sight. Then we have the Lord of the Void. If he deals combat damage to a player, we exile the top 7 cards of their library and put a creature card from among those onto our battlefield under our control. Then we have a game changer in Jin-Gitaxias Core Augur. This lets us dump everybody else's hands except ours throughout the game, making it very hard to deal with us. Then we have Jin-Gitaxias Progress Tyrant, written in Phyrexian because Update to Cheapest doesn't really care about whether or not I'm able to actually read the card. So let's flip him over to a much more readable Jin-Gitaxias Progress Tyrant. When we cast an artifact, instant, or sorcery spell, we get to copy that spell, but if our opponents try to cast them, they have to get rid of the first spell they cast, letting it be automatically countered, and then they can try again afterwards. Jin is a fantastic card in forcing the opponents to try to play around you and work around you. Then after that, we have an Overlord of the Flood Pits. This card is a fantastic way to dig through our deck and put even more great reanimation targets in the graveyard. It draws us cards and then discards cards, and it does it every single time it attacks, and as a 5/3 flyer, it can put opponents onto a clock. Then we have Diluvian Primordial and Sepulchre Primordial. Both of these allow us to yank a ton of resources out of our opponent's graveyards and use them against them. The Diluvian Primordial casts an instant or sorcery from every opponent's grave, and the Sepulchre Primordial reanimates a creature from every opponent's grave. Then we have the Sire of Stagnation. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under our opponent's control, they exile the top 2 cards of their library, which can be disruptive, but the real kicker here is that we get to draw 2 cards when this happens. So, effectively, as long as our opponents are playing on curve and not playing any mana ramp spells, Sire of Stagnation is drawing us 6 cards a turn, potentially more, and very rarely less. Then we have, 6 cards a turn cycle. Then we have the Scion of Darkness. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, we may put any creature from their graveyard onto our battlefield under our control. And we have the Scholar of the Lost Trove. When this enters the battlefield, when we cast an instant, sorcery, or artifact card from our graveyard without paying its mana cost, and then exile that card. Scholar of the Lost Trove is an extender in this deck. If we cast it from our hand, yes, we get a free spell out of our grave, which is great, but if we reanimate this with a reanimate spell, we can then use it to get that reanimate spell back and double dip. Then we have the Thieving Amalgam. At the beginning of every opponent's upkeep, we yank the top card of their library and put it on our board as a manifested 2/2 creature. And of course, we can flip those anytime we have the mana to spend on them. And whenever a creature we control but do not own dies, its owner loses 2 life and we gain 2 life, letting us have an ever-increasing amount of collateral on our board to harm our opponents with. Then, with all of these cards that are incredibly powerful, some of them are not legendary, and to make use of them, we are going to be running a Glasspole Mimic, and it's mostly in here because it is an MDFC, and MDFCs are 3. And with all these powerful creatures, we also want to make sure that they are able to stick around on the board for a long time, especially cards like Valgavoth. So let's go ahead and give them some more protection in the form of Lightning Greaves, Swiftfoot Boots, and another MDFC Hydroelectric Specimen. The boots all give Shroud and Hexproof, but the Specimen allows us to flash it in whenever our opponent tries to target one of our cards with an instant or sorcery spell, and it will divert the spell over to the Specimen. And of course, it is an MDFC, so it is basically a free include in your deck. It's a no-brainer style of card that you can just shove in whenever you feel like it. The thing is fantastic, and that does it for the core strategy of the deck. The goal is very simple. Put Big Dumb Thing in grave, then put Big Dumb Thing on the battlefield, and ruin everybody's weekend. But we are not done there. Obviously, our commander is a great draw engine in his own right, but he needs to be supported by an equally strong draw engine on the back end. So let's go ahead and talk about the rest of our draw package. We're going to be running a 10-card draw package on top of our commander, though one of these is getting more expensive as we speak, and I don't know why. It is stock up. I'm just kidding. I know why stock up is getting expensive. I talked about this as a 40-cent card when it came out, and now it's sitting at about $5 because people are seeing competitive success with it in 60-card formats. So I'm happy that the card is performing well, but I really wish my uncommon could have stayed 40 cents. Anyway, this is an uncapped budget version of the deck, so we can just put stock up in here. Look at the top 5 cards of our library, put 2 into our hand. Dig Through Time also lets us put look at the top 7 and put 2 into our hand with the ability to discount its mana cost, and Memory Deluge lets us look at the top 4 and put 2 into our hand with a flashback cost, which will let us look at the top 7 instead. Then we have a couple reanimation targets, which are fantastic to hit. We have Sphinx of the Second Sun, which gives us untap step, draw, power, and all kinds of stuff at the end of our turn, and a Nezahal Primal Tide, which has a lot of text. We have no maximum hand size, it can't be countered. When an opponent casts a non-creature spell, we draw a card, we can discard 3 cards to blink Nezahal for protection. Guy does a lot, and if you haven't messed around with Nezahal, he is a joy to find ways to abuse. Then we have a bunch of other cards that read almost identically to our commander. Matsulani the Great Door can let us draw and discard cards while also being able to flip into a land that gives us lots and lots more mana than we normally would have. Likeness Looter is another copy of our commander that also allows us to transform him into a copy of any creature in our grave. Jace Viren's Prodigy lets us do the same thing as our commander, but if there are 5 more cards in our graveyard, we can then flip him over to Jace Telepath Unbound, where we can cast instants or sorceries from our graveyard, meaning he is effectively a 1-to-1 counterpart to what our commander is able to do. Then we have Rona, Herald of Invasion. Whenever we cast a legendary spell, we can untap her, and of course, she's got draw discard just like our commander does. If we transform her, she becomes Rona the Talarian Obliterator, and whenever a source deals damage to Rona, then that source's controller exiles a card from their hand at random. If it's a land, we put it on the battlefield, otherwise we cast it without paying its cost. This is mostly here so that if we know that somebody's going to have a Blasphemous Act as one of their only outs to our board, we just flip Rona preemptively, knowing that we'll just get some free spells from them if it comes down to that. Then we have Obsessive Stitcher, which lets us draw a card and discard a card, just like our commander, and can also sacrifice herself to reanimate any creature card from our graveyard, meaning she is, again, an almost 1-to-1 of our commander. Since our commander is going to be looking to recast any of our reanimation spells, Obsessive Stitcher just kind of cuts the fat on that. I really wish she could have been a commander as well. That does it for all of the big, wonderful draw spells in our deck that are kind of sort of just doing the same thing as our commander, but we do still need to make sure that our opponents are not able to win the game while we are durdling around with our hand and graveyard. So let's go ahead and talk about a very, very girthy removal package. And when I say girthy, I mean girthy. We are running 18 targeted removal spells and 3 board wipes. Whew, let's go ahead and get into all of these. The first one is Vile Mutilator, a wonderful reanimation target that makes every opponent sack a non-token creature and an enchantment. Then we have Circular Logic, which can be discarded with Vohar to counter any spell, as long as our opponents are not able to pay 1 for every card in our graveyard. Speaking of counter spells, let's also throw in a Negate to counter any non-creature spell, an Offer We Can't Refuse to counter any non-creature spell, as long as we're willing to give our opponents some treasures, an Arcane Denial to counter any spell as long as we're okay to give our opponents some cards, and a counter spell as long as we're okay having 2 open blue mana. Let's throw in a Feed the Swarm and a Resculpt to have the easy access 2 mana removal for artifacts, creatures, and enchantments. And since we're discarding a lot of cards, let's throw in Archfiend of Ilfnir. This card allows us to make all of our opponent's creatures take a -1/-1 counter every single time we cycle or discard a card, which we will be doing a lot of given the kind of deck that we are playing. Let's also throw in some MDFCs in here to give our deck a little more versatility. Hagra Mauling is a land on one side and a murder on the other, while Fell the Profane is identical, except that its backside land can come to play untapped. Then we're going to throw in a Withering Torment, a slight power creep of Feed the Swarm, but at $1.50 we don't get to run this in many of our budget decks, blowing up any creatures, any enchantments, and only at the cost of 2 life and 1 more mana than what Feed the Swarm is asking of us. Then let's throw in a Shard of the Void Dragon, which every time it swings will force our opponents to sack non-land permanents, and if an artifact is put into a graveyard from a battlefield, then we can put 2/1 counters on the Shard of the Void Dragon, making this a wonderful clock that our opponents are going to struggle to keep up with. Then one of my favorite reanimation targets of all time, an Archon of Cruelty. Draws us cards, makes our opponents discard cards, makes them lose life, makes us gain life, and makes our opponents sacrifice creatures anytime it enters the battlefield or attacks. Then a Shadowgrange Archfiend to make our opponents sacrifice their strongest creatures, and of course, because Shadowgrange Archfiend does come down with a madness cost, we can just reanimate this manually by tapping our commander, which is insane. Then let's add in Toxrill the Corrosive, because who needs friends, am I right? We have one big sluggy boy here, putting our friends' cards with 1/1 counters, or -1/-1 counters, every single turn is an insane thing to put on people, and players are going to try their best to get rid of this as fast as humanly possible. He also can let us sack slugs to draw cards, which is neat, and he makes tokens, which is neat, but the real reason he's here is for psychic damage. Then we have the combo of Sheoldred the Whispering One and good old just vanilla Sheoldred. Regular Sheoldred here lets our opponent sacrifice creatures when she comes onto the battlefield, and of course, if she gets the ability to flip, then she makes us blow up cards from each opponent's battlefield, make our opponents discard cards out of their hand, and mill cards, and then of course she's a Rise of the Dark Realm on the backside. And Sheoldred Whispering One just makes our opponent sacrifice creatures every single turn, while we get to reanimate creatures whenever our turn comes up. Honestly, this thing is a nightmare incarnate, and I do not agree with the opinions of certain other YouTubers who say this card is bad. I do not understand where they are coming from. The decks that run this really, really like this card. Anyway, let's also have some board wipes. Let's throw in a Toxic Deluge. It's one of the most mana-efficient board wipes in Magic the Gathering, making all of our opponent's creatures get neg-X, neg-X based on the life we're willing to pay. A Massacre Worm, which can get rid of lots of creatures at once and also can cause our opponents to be on a clock as they lose creatures. It can also shut down Aristocrat players, which is a great side effect of Massacre Worm being what it is. And then, of course, a Necromantic Selection to blow up all the creatures on the board except the one that we want to keep by reanimating that card. Also, in a pinch, you can use Necromantic Selection to reanimate a creature from an opponent's graveyard that is a commander before that commander has the ability to scoot its way onto the command zone, as Necromantic Selection only has one big ol' line of text with no breaks in paragraph. This means there is no break at which your opponent can actually move their commander into the command zone. Just a wonderful ruling thing that Necromantic Selection does that sometimes people don't even realize is a thing that the card can accomplish. Anyway, that's all of our removal, and that should keep our opponents targeting us in a game of Archenemy effectively. But let's go ahead and talk about the lands and ramp in the deck too, because that's also important, right? So our deck aims to be very low to the ground in terms of what it's doing, so we don't need a lot of ramp spells, honestly, and casting our commander on turn 2 means that we don't need a ton of level 2 mana rocks in the first place, so we're just running some very basic ramp today. A singular Soul Ring, an Arcane Signet, a Talisman of Dominance, a Dimir Signet, a Fell Warstone, and a Wayfarer's Bauble. Wayfarer's Bauble is the safest of all of these because it gives us land ramp, but I mean, really, these are all just the generic Dimir rocks. You could replace them with anything that you prefer. We don't need to be running anything fancy in our ramp package because it's just not super important. For lands, we are running 4 islands and 6 swamps with a lot of dual lands, just a whole lot of dual lands. Since we are not limited by budget, we will go from least expensive to most expensive. River of Tears, Choked Estuary, Darkwater Catacombs, Dimir Aqueduct to reset our wonderful, wonderful utility lands. Exotic Orchard, Temple of Deceit, because I've been won over by these things, I guess. Command Tower, Sunken Hollow, because it is searchable and comes into play untapped. Shipwreck Marsh, Underground River, a Painland, Drowned Catacombs, Tainted Isle, and yes, I said I'd be going in ascending order for cost. I lied because of where my mouse happened to be. A Clearwater Pathway, because it can be whatever land you want it to be. It is the ditto of Dimir lands. A Gloomlake Verge, because I really like the new lands that came out. Watery Grave, because it's a shock land. Morphic Pool, because we usually fight with that many people. Sunken Ruins, because Wizards doesn't know how to reprint filter lands. And Underground Sewers. When did you become a $27 card? Hold up, what? How? When? Why did that happen? What? I don't remember this becoming a $30 land. How did the tap land? How did the tap land become more expensive than the shock land? What parallel universe am I living in? Anyway, I gotta get off that one. We have the fetching lands of Ash Barrens, Myriad Landscape, and Polluted Delta, although you could run real fetches in every single one of these slots if you so chose. And we're running a few utility lands as well. Takenuma to let us get a card out of our grave whenever we want. Tomb Fortress, so we have Reanimate on a stick. Port of Carfell, so we have Reanimate on a land as well. And Bojuka Bog, because we are playing a black deck. And again, I've seen YouTubers say the Bojuka Bog isn't as good as it used to be. I do not agree with any of these opinions. Run a bounce land in your deck, and Bojuka Bog goes back to your hand, and now you can use it whenever you want, even if you had to use it as a land early on in the game. I will never understand people cutting Bojuka Bog out of their deck for, I don't know, basic lands. I've seen some weird shit on the internet, man. Anyway, that's all of the lands in our deck, and with what is here, the deck should be really, really simple. You're just discarding cards and reanimating big dumb things, but let's go ahead and get into the gameplay real quick to show you what this deck is kind of trying to do. If I'm being honest, any hand that has a reanimation spell and a reanimation target is good to keep, but this hand in particular has a second copy of our commander with Jace Vryn's Prodigy. I'm willing to gamble on this hand, actually. So let's go ahead and draw our opening hand card, and that's a Soul Ring. Okay, we are going to play a Morphic Pool, and we are going to tap it for a Wayfarer's Bauble, because we don't gain anything from playing that Soul Ring right now. Moving into turn 2, we have an Ancient Brass Dragon, a fantastic card for us to get out. Let's go ahead and play a land and tap 2 and get our commander out onto the battlefield. The reason we are doing this in this sequence is because this is the least threatening sequence we could do our cards in. If we play the Soul Ring really early, yes, we feel great and wonderful, but we are actually slowing our game plan down because we have an on-curve game plan commander. And on top of slowing our game plan down, we are putting a giant target on our back, which we just don't want to do. Now, let's move into turn 3. We have Toxrill. Now is the time to go ahead and put big targets on our back. Let's pay 1. Let's go ahead and put Soul Ring out. And let's go ahead and... You know what? No, we don't have a bounce land out now. So we can put a Bojuka Bog down, and we can tap the Soul Ring, crack the Wayfarer's Bauble, go into the library and grab ourselves a Swamp and bring that out as well. Now we have a fuck ton of mana, and we can pass over to our opponents and while we wait for them to do things, we are going to tap Vohar, and we are going to draw a card and discard a card. We're going to discard that Toxrill. We already played the Soul Ring. Let's go ahead and put a giant target on our back. Moving into turn 4, let's go ahead and play the Port of Karfeld down as our land. And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We have 6 mana available. We do not have the ability to do anything yet. Let's tap Vohar to draw a card and discard the Sepulchre Primordial. And we are going to tap 1, 2, 3, and get Jace out here. We'll have to do it this way, actually. Now, if our opponents do any type of powerful play, we are going to use the Haggard Mauling to get rid of that card, whatever it happens to be, and we move into our next turn. We have 4 cards in our graveyard. We need a few more in our graveyard to make our strategy work. So let's tap Vohar to draw a card and discard this swamp that we don't need at the moment, and tap Jace. Yep, draw a card, discard a card. We will draw a card, and we will discard... we want to keep the Dig Through Time, so let's discard the Temple of Deceit. Yeah, we can get more lands. Yeah, we'll discard the Temple of Deceit. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yeah, we can make this all work. And then that allows us to flip Jace. And now we can use his ability of targeting instant or sorcery card in our graveyard. And let's see, we can cast target instant or sorcery. We can cast one in our grave. We don't need to do that just now. I think right now the move is cracking our land. Boom. And let's go ahead and get Toxrill out right now. That is going to put a giant target on our back, but it is a Toxrill. On turn 5, it is going to be harming a lot of our opponents. And you know what? Let's go ahead and say... I still have to pay mana for the Jace thing, so let's go ahead and just tick Jace up and not worry too terribly much about his effect. Our opponent's turns comes up. They are definitely not letting us keep Toxrill. There's no world in which they let us keep Toxrill. Let's go ahead and tap Vohar to draw a card and discard a card. That's going to be a Lord of the Void we are going to discard. And let's go ahead and pay 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Let's persist. Let's bring up... let's do Persist and Stitch Together. So Stitch Together is first. Stitch Together is going to bring up Toxrill, and then Persist is going to bring up Sepulchre Primordial. The Sepulchre Primordial is going to get whatever powerful cards our opponents have in the grave. It doesn't matter what they are. We are just taking them. They are ours, and Toxrill is back. I hope our opponents have a way to deal with Toxrill now. If they don't, that just kind of blows for them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We have 1 more mana available, but we've used all of our black mana, so we are kind of stuck where we're at the moment. Actually, no, we're not stuck. Yeah, no, we are stuck. We are stuck where we are right now because we don't have the black mana. That's fine. We tick up Jace. We pass to our opponent's turn. They are definitely killing Toxrill again. There's no world in which they do not kill Toxrill over and over and over again. So we get to draw a card. Let's go ahead and put Lightning Greaves out. Actually, no, we don't need to do that. We don't have any reason to do that. We are going to tick Jace down. 1, 2, 3. And we are going to cast Stitch Together from our grave. We're going to put Toxrill back out right now. Nobody is going to be happy about that, but we are. And we are going to put a set of Lightning Greaves on Toxrill. This time, he is sticking around for the long haul. Let's go ahead and pay 2 and feed the Swarm whatever powerful card our opponents have. And let's tap our Vohar to draw a card and discard this Valgavoth. We can now use Jace in the following turn. We've already used Stitch Together, so we're kind of out of options there, but that's fine. We pass to our opponents, and on their turn, we are going to Dig Through Time. We know that we want to keep Valgavoth and Lord of the Void. Every other card here is basically able to be gotten rid of. Yeah, we want to keep these 2 reanimation targets. Actually, yeah, I want to keep these reanimation targets. No, we could just persist Lord of the Void, actually. I guess it depends. In a world where we have the dominant position, then we do this move. In a world where we lose the dominant position but we keep Jace, then we keep Persist and Lord of the Void. But I think I'm going to gamble. I'm actually okay gambling. on pulling another reanimation spell, especially if Dig Through Time can find... Oh, wait, hold on. We don't have to make that choice. I can keep Persist because there's a Wayfarer's Bauble in there. Never mind. All roads lead to the road where we persist to Lord of the Void and give it Lightning Greaves. Anyway, Dig Through Time is going to let us look at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We can use Jace to reanimate anything we want, so I think the correct move is taking 2 counterspells off the top of our deck. By getting 2 counterspells from the top of our deck, we put ourselves in a very, very powerful position where we can dictate the pace of the game going forward. So, let's go ahead and go into the next turn. Glasspool Mimic. Oh boy, we get to do dumb stuff. Let's go ahead and use Glasspool Mimic to become a copy of Sepulchre Primordial. And we're going to keep Offer You Can't Refuse up. So we are going to use Jace's ability again. And we are going to persist up this Lord of the Void. And after persisting up the Lord of the Void, we are going to move the Lightning Greaves to the Lord of the Void. And we're going to punch an opponent with the Lord of the Void and reanimate a creature from their graveyard. Put a creature from among them. Reanimate a creature from the top 7 cards of their library onto ours. So we have stolen 6 creatures with Sepulchre Primordials. And we are stealing a 7th creature with Lord of the Void. And Toxrill is getting rid of every creature on their boards right now. We're in a stupidly strong position, and if our opponents say no, we give them an offer they can't refuse and say, go fuck yourself. So we are in a stupidly powerful spot. If, for some reason, our opponents didn't scoop out of the madness that we have put them through here, our draw is a Memory Deluge, which we can use to get even further into our deck and pull more reanimation spells out. Honestly, this deck is stupidly strong and can make you an archenemy at the table very, very, very fast. And that should be the reason that you're playing it. You are playing this to be the table's villain who needs to be taken down. And if you're thinking this deck seems very close in design to my Sauron Oops All Lieutenants deck, thank you for noticing. This is almost a 1-to-1 in execution of the Sauron Oops All Lieutenants deck, with the difference being this deck is based a little more on control and a little less on being completely overpowering. But that comes down to having an itty-bitty commander that nobody is going to see as super powerful. Nobody's going to look at your Merfolk Looter of the command zone and think that that's going to be the strongest thing that they're going to have to deal with today. And then they're going to realize that it was all a lie, and you are actually here to cause copious amounts of pain and suffering. That all said, that does it for this deck build. If you haven't already, please consider following me over on Blue Sky. Please consider following this channel and supporting me over here if you haven't already. Just the bell notification icon is fantastic for that. Also, let your friends know about this channel if you haven't already. Maybe consider supporting me over on Patreon, where I talk about the background of things that are going on both of my channels. You can even consider supporting me over on fourthwall.com by grabbing the channel's playmat. And of course, I stream just about every Monday through Thursday. So please go check me out at youtube.com/SurisLive or twitch.com/NekoSuris. With that all said, thank you for watching, and hopefully y'all are having a wonderful, wonderful day. Insert end of video tagline here. Hey, thanks for making it to the end of the video. I really could not do any of this without all of you. Those of you watching, and especially those of you who support me on Patreon. I wanted to go ahead and take a minute to thank all of you who do that, because with YouTube being what it is these days, I really cannot do this full-time without the support from each and every one of you. Those people would be Red Joker, Purple Poundini, Jemshin, Britzkrieg, Jupe the Malignant, Michael, Ravelern, Mabbity Babbity, Astral Frontier, Tales of Atonement, Nixie Chan, Kiri Artemis, Victorian Alchemist, I'm not saying the last part of that, and you know that, Arcton Arclacier, Kiratorian, Dren Hadamata, Jordan M, John L, Lord Bleck, Smiling Game Master, and Fire Shard. thank you so very much. But since you're here, why not go ahead and try watching another one? There should be one that's on the screen right now. And if you are a patron of mine, I wanted to go ahead and thank you again for all of your support. There is still a video you could press though, if you'd like. I would appreciate it just a little bit.